Welcome to the Law School Toolbox Podcast. Today, we're talking about emotional intelligence for lawyers. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the Catapult Conference. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about something that's not really discussed all that often in law school, which is emotional intelligence. So, Lee, why is this even important? I mean, isn't this kind of a waste of time?
Well, it's funny. You and I had separate conversations with separate people about this issue within the last couple of days. So I definitely think that means that it's probably important. But, you know, I think a lot of people think that being a lawyer is really about just being a master of the law. But the practice of lawyering is really about people. And I think this is something that's oftentimes forgotten. Sure, if you practice corporate law, your clients really aren't people, but you still have to deal with clients that work for that company, and those still are people. So yeah, it really is all about people.
There's no like platonic ideal of the clients. You know, you might hear other people in the firm or opposing counsel or co-counsel who are like, well, the client wants this. It's like, unless it's an individual, there's not one person. You know, like if the client, you're dealing with a bunch of competing needs and competing desires and that sort of thing too. So I really think being able to manage those sort of situations is a huge part of being a lawyer.
For sure. I mean, let's think about the different ways that people really need their lawyers. I think people definitely are going to look for you for guidance. This is really any sort of law you practice. A client is typically coming to a lawyer because they have a problem and they need guidance. So it's not always a crisis, but it's often a crisis.
Well, and it's typically something important or they wouldn't be bothering to pay a lawyer.
Right. It's true.
You know, I mean, even if it's not an actual crisis situation, think about like if you're an estate planning lawyer, like that's hugely emotional for people. Like you're dealing with death, you're dealing with family relationships. I would say there's almost no type of law where you're not dealing with some sort of high impact, high stakes type of thing.
I think that's very true. I think another thing that people often forget is sometimes you're not just dealing with your one individual client. Like we mentioned in the corporate context, you could have a lot of people that really make up the client. But let's say that you practice some sort of family law or criminal law or immigration. You're also typically working with an entire family that maybe is in the middle of a crisis or is dealing with a challenging situation. You may not be representing all of them, but you're probably going to be interacting with a lot of different people, all of whom may be scared or need someone to really be their translator in dealing with the legal process, because it's very frustrating when you're not comfortable with it.
Right, and rarely are people talking to a lawyer when they're their best, most stable selves.
It's true. And you know, or even if they're not in crisis, people are often making big life-changing decisions. You know, sure, if you do prenups for a living, maybe people aren't in crisis because they're happy to be getting married, but they're making big life-changing decisions about how they want to structure their marriage or their eventual end of the marriage, if that is what happens. And that's some serious stuff, guys. That's no joke.
That's going to be pretty emotional.
It's going to be emotional and challenging. And I really think that we get so caught up in the law that oftentimes we forget that we need to learn how to navigate what can be some really rough waters for our clients.
Oh, yeah. I remember a friend of mine who practiced family law, and she said, you know, it really mystifies me when people I work with or tell me, I just don't think I can keep doing this. Like my clients are so emotional. She's like, you're a family lawyer. Like, what did you expect? Of course they're emotional. Like, what about this is surprising to you? Like, you didn't know this when you signed up to do this type of law? You know? Like, of course you're spending your time being a therapist. This person's marriage is falling apart.
Yeah, I think it's really true. And if you have ever been a client of a lawyer because you've needed their help for something, I think that It is a very emotional place, even if it's not something that's particularly emotional. Anytime that we end up hiring counsel to help us with a business problem that you and I don't have expertise in, it can still be very kind of frustrating and emotional because we don't have control over the situation. We just have to trust that somebody else knows what's going on.
Right, exactly. And, we're talking about two lawyers hiring another lawyer. We understand at least the basic lingo. We can go do basic research if we want to understand something better, but your clients can't necessarily do any of that.
Yeah. So I think it's a good exercise for every lawyer to have had to be a client at some point, to have just
absolutely
a bit of an appreciation for what it's like to be on the other side of the table.
Well, and I think I read somewhere, I could be making this up, but I'm pretty sure I read it, that the people who are most likely to get sued for malpractice are not actually those who necessarily commit the largest mistakes. They're the ones with the least good emotional coping skills.
Interesting.
So it's like, your client's not going to sue you necessarily because you made a mistake. They're going to sue you because you really pissed them off.
That's very interesting. And I can see that being true, actually.
Oh, yeah, exactly. It's like, somebody who takes responsibility and tries to make the situation better and owns it and is empathetic, like they're going to have far less likelihood of being sued, I would think.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I think that most law students forget when they're entering the profession is that the law is really about conflict. That most people...
Well, parts of the law.
But
Litigation.
But anytime you have two parties working on anything together, there is oftentimes some sort of conflict. Even if you have two parties negotiating a business contract, it's probably likely that they're not going to agree on everything. So there are different levels of conflict.
Yeah, I guess I was having a conversation recently with someone who practices corporate law, and I practice litigation, and we were sort of talking about the differences. And I guess for me, like one of the real differences is that there's a possibility, at least in corporate law, of like a win-win solution, whereas that's generally not going to be the outcome in litigation.
I think that's true. But if you hate conflict at all, I think you need to start thinking about different ways to cope with that reality, because so much of your job is either trying to find that win-win situation to dispel the conflict or to shepherd your clients through the conflict so they can get out the other side, hopefully as unscathed as possible.
Right. I mean, I think particularly for people who are interested in going into litigation, you really have to ask yourself, am I comfortable with ongoing conflict in my job on a daily basis? And if the answer is no, then this is really probably something you might need to reevaluate.
I think that's true. And I think when you think about conflict, you have to think about all the different types of conflict that can happen in the practice of law, because you have conflicts between clients, your client and somebody else. There are definitely conflicts with opposing counsel. I mean, that's what a lot of lawyers talk about, is having to just deal with the other lawyers can create a lot of conflict.
And having co-counsel. I mean, I used to do these enormous patent cases where there might be 8 different defendants, all of whom had their own counsel.
Yep, I did those cases
half the
too.
time, you spend half as much time, you spend a lot of your time just dealing with conflicts among your co-defendants about what the best path forward was, much less dealing with opposing counsel.
Sometimes you will be appearing before a judge that maybe you don't have a great relationship with. So that is another form of conflict. So, having the emotional intelligence to deal with these difficult situations is critical, because no matter what type of law you're going to practice, you're going to find conflict somewhere, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if nothing else, having more emotional intelligence and more emotional awareness of your own reactions and things like that can actually really benefit you in just reading a situation.
That's true.
People say like, oh, it's going to make me soft if I understand my feelings. It's like, no, you're going to realize what's actually going on in a group dynamic faster than anyone else does.
Yeah, I think that's really, really true. And some lawyers, like your friend who was practicing family law was saying, you end up kind of being a part-time therapist and a part-time lawyer. You're helping people make life decisions and major life choices, and you have to be ready to cope with that, or you need to reevaluate which area of law you want to go into if that's not something you're interested in.
Yeah, I think for a certain personality type, that can be a great fit. For other people, that would be an absolute hell.
I was talking with another friend who used to do domestic violence investigations and prosecutions. And, she was talking about how many times she was just giving advice to her victims about how to handle restraining orders and, how to communicate with different family members about the reality. I mean, stuff that wasn't exactly on par with the legal work that she was doing, but that's what her clients needed of her. And that it was important to her to be able to be that kind of liaison with the system for her clients. And she needed to have the skills to be able to have those conversations with her client and just not feel like saying, well, that's not really, like, your case is over. So you need to go talk to somebody else. Who are they going to talk to?
Right. And I think sometimes lawyers forget because we get so caught up in like the strategy or the law or the legal arguments. But for people who are not used to dealing with the legal system, even outside of, some highly emotional context, even if it's just a litigation, like even if you're, say, doing an interview with a possible witness or something, for that person, this is a really stressful situation for them to be in. Mm-hmm. So, even if they're on your team and on your side, they're still not happy about doing this meeting. So, the more that you can kind of acknowledge that and say, hey, I really appreciate you coming today. Like, I recognize you're taking time out of your schedule. I'm going to keep this as brief as possible. You're not on trial or whatever, whatever you can say to the person to sort of empathize with their position and not just start being like, oh, well, we need you to testify about this or that, or, that's just not going to work well.
Yeah, I was in a law professor's office when he got a phone call about the fact that he had to testify at a trial related to some sort of private legal work that he did before he was a law professor. And he wasn't a party to the action. He was just being called to be his witness. And he went like a ghost white during this phone call. And I remember afterwards, then he said, oh, I have to go testify. And it's just like my worst nightmare. And of course I'm sitting there thinking, you're a law professor, you are a partner at a large law firm. Like, you've got skills, man. Right? But I think
you have context.
Yeah. But it was just really interesting to me that this person who was so successful and, and had this persona to speak in front of people was very unnerved by being in this position, that he wasn't used to. And it was a great wake up call that almost everybody is going to feel nervous. And I hope that the lawyers who had to put him in that position were conscious of that, because it probably helped the process and helped him be a better witness.
Yeah, absolutely. I think managing people's emotional conditions, if you are coaching them for witness prep and things like that, is a huge, huge part of what that is your job, basically. Yeah. It's not just the legal stuff.
I think that's fair.
Because if your witness falls apart in a deposition, you have a serious legal problem.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very true. And, have empathy and compassion for what people are going through. I think it goes a long way, if they realize that you're a human being and not just a lawyer.
Well, I mean, those are pretty much contradictory, right? Isn't that the whole point of being a lawyer? Like, you don't have to be a human being anymore. You're a lawyer. I do think a lot of people think that. They think that, basically to be a good lawyer, you have to learn to tamp down all of your emotional reactions and you can't show any emotions and things like that. But personally, I think that is just completely counterproductive.
I think that is true.
This is a people business, like you said earlier.
Yeah, you don't necessarily need to be, a weepy open book, but I don't think you should turn off your emotions. I think that you need to be able to acknowledge your emotions and move past them at times, because you may need to be the person that doesn't get to lose it. But
yeah, and I actually read an interesting article earlier today where people who think that they've repressed their emotions and that they're not feeling them, if they do, MRIs and things, they find out you are actually still experiencing them. You're just not consciously experiencing it, but you're still having the reaction. Whereas if you acknowledge what you're feeling, like, wow, I feel very angry because of this email. Even just that labeling of, I feel angry because this person was rude to me on the phone, or I'm sad that my client's dog died, whatever it is, that labeling actually enables the emotion to pass.
Interesting.
Yeah,
that's fascinating. So these skills sound pretty important. So what class do we take in law school to get these skills?
Well, maybe look in the business school. Some of them have them.
The psychology department of the undergrad.
Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, you guys, you're kind of on your own when gaining a lot of these skills. So we have a couple suggestions about how to work on your emotional intelligence. But it's something that's probably going to be an ongoing activity, I guess, is to learn more about life as you move forward in life.
Right. And some law schools are starting to have these classes. And if they are, that's great and you should take them. We highly recommend it. But the reality is most of them are still, like, I would say quite a long way behind the train on this one. I mean, business schools for quite a long time have been asking these questions of their students, have been training them for these situations, and law schools just haven't really been doing that.
Yeah. So one of the ways that Alison and I love to learn things is we read books. So I think that reading different books on anything really, on suffering, on overcoming obstacles, on vulnerability, on dealing with emotions, I think that a lot of books can be really helpful because you can take nuggets of them that you really carry with you. So we talk about her a lot, but I've got to mention her again, Brene Brown. She's just so amazing. Her TED Talks and her books. She talks a lot about being vulnerable. Some of the stuff, I think it was in her last book that I found really interesting, was really identifying. She talks about what we tell as our story about something. So when something happens, we create a backstory to kind of explain what's happening that can be completely false, and to really start unpacking that and trying to see why we're reacting to certain situations and make sure we're reading them correctly. I think a lot of these types of exercises can be really helpful when you're trying to figure out, conversations between folks that could be very emotionally charged, to be able to kind of strip things down and see what's at the root of the conflict.
Well, also particularly, I mean, almost always when you have a conflict that's a legal conflict, you got multiple sides of the same story. Mm-hmm. So being able to have that skill set of really taking a step back and listening to all of the different stories and all of the different versions, and then trying to piece together, well, what actually really happened here, not being of the viewpoint of like, well, my client said this and your client said that, but like what really went on here, I think is very valuable.
I think that is really valuable. I know both you and I have read separately, even before we met, but read different books in Buddhism and Buddhist teachings, especially around suffering and happiness. I guess those are two. I guess those are
two sides of the same
coin. But I think the Dalai Lama's books are really worthwhile. They're easy to digest. They can be kind of pleasant recorded books if you like to listen to things in the car or on your phone, when you're commuting to work. But I think you and I have both read When Things Fall Apart.
I have, although I prefer, that's by Pema Chandran.
Yeah.
I have read that one. I prefer The Places That Scare You, but I think they're both good.
Yeah. So
very similar. Read one or the other. You don't need to read both. I've read them both. You can pick one.
Yeah. But there's a lot of wisdom in there. And if you're going through a challenging time, I think it can be a good time to explore some different readings and philosophies on how to overcome challenges. And those learnings that you will take away will stay with you, and you can offer that same guidance to other people when they are struggling. So you can even take your own struggles as an opportunity to learn and kind of move forward. I think that's why I originally started reading Buddhist teachings, was kind of, not really sure how to create my own happiness when I was young in my 20s, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life. And I still remember those readings when I talk to other people in their 20s who aren't really sure what to do with their lives.
Yeah, I've given out a lot of copies of The Places That Scare You. And one of the things I like about those type of books is that they're practical. Mm-hmm. There actually are practical, physical things that you can do, you can start to do and start to train yourself to do in an emotionally charged situation that enable you to be less reactive. Mm-hmm. I think you've given an example before from someone who teaches mindfulness, who's a lawyer, who says, just count to 10 before you send that email, or take 3 deep breaths before you answer the phone when you see that the number is someone you might be stressed out when you talk to.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really true. And one of the things about this current legal environment, because of technology, is everything is very immediate. The same lawyer was telling the story about how it used to be when somebody sent something inflammatory, it was sent in a letter. And so the letter would be in your inbox, and then you would choose when you would open the letters in your inbox, and you would see who it was from, and then you would read the letter, and you would be incredibly angry, and then you would lay it to the side until you had time to draft the letter, and then you would draft it, and then you would edit it, and then maybe you send it to your secretary who would print it out on the letterhead and then give it back to you, where you would read it again and then you would sign it before you would send it back. So those are a lot of opportunities for you to cool off and evaluate and almost be mindful about what was happening, versus now when you get something inflammatory in your email, you get angry.
Probably on your phone.
Or on your phone, you get angry and you immediately shoot back whatever, thought comes to mind most of the time. And that tends to escalate things.
Yeah. So I think, those kind of like break points where you might be ready to send off a nasty email, and maybe you say to yourself, you know what? Maybe I should just go have a coffee, and then when I come back, I can look at this email and see if it's really exactly what I think would be productive to say. And maybe by the time you walk around the block and have a coffee, you think, this might just be making the situation a little worse.
Yeah. It's so
maybe
true.
I should do something differently.
I was watching a show that came out on HBO a little while ago called The Divorce, or I think it's just Divorce, with Sarah Jessica Parker in it. And what was interesting about the storyline, to not give it away, but one of the things that I found interesting was the little things people can do to just escalate a situation without intending to do it. And so from a lawyer's perspective, as I'm watching this, this is not really about the lawyer perspective at all, but there are, of course, lawyers in it. It's called Divorce. But from the lawyer perspective, that's what I found interesting, is how fast something can spin into something that wasn't intended by little, maybe unintentional actions to create a new reality. And I think that that's something that you have to be really conscious of in the legal context, is when, these little escalations start, taking something that should have been very small and maybe should have been dismissed and turn it into something that's very, very big.
Right, because I'm sure we've all done that in our personal lives, some super minor detail, and then suddenly you're in like a 3-day fight and no one can even remember what started it. And then you look back and you're like, did we really have that huge argument over this one stupid thing?
Right.
But like court cases start that way.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure. Especially if you're emotionally charged about something else. Major litigation have started over little things that probably should never have been litigated. I think it happens all the time.
I remember I was doing a case and we had a settlement meeting, and it was one of those situations where I was just sitting there watching this spiral out of control on both sides. And it was this case that clearly should settle. Everybody was basically knew the number they should be settling for. And it just blew up in minutes until I think one of the plaintiffs was sobbing. This is a patent case. One of the plaintiffs is sobbing, runs out of the room saying, I'm never going to settle. The lead counsel is banging his fist on the table and yelling, get the fuck out of my office. Yeah. And you've got the general counsel's there screaming, and you're just like, what just happened?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's crazy. It's really bizarre what can happen. It's been very interesting because I read a lot of parenting books now that I have a toddler. And one of the things that I find interesting about the parenting books is they really recommend you to choose your words carefully, which I think is something that as adults we are really bad about because we forget that words can really have meaning. So one thing that I had heard before and I'd read before, but it's come up a lot around working with young children, is how the term but can negate something that you've already said. So for example, I really appreciate that you did that, but I don't like apples after dinner. It doesn't matter that all you would have heard from that is I don't like apples after dinner. The compliment I gave you is gone, but has just totally negated it. We do this all the time. I do this all the time. I never think about it. We do it with our significant others. We do it with, random people on the street. But it's well researched that something as little as using the word but can really hurt somebody's feelings. And you may think that you are giving someone a compliment, but you are completely negating it. And so little things like this, just paying attention to what you say and being deliberate with some of your speech even can make a huge difference. So opening yourself up to learn lessons from other parts of your life that you could weave into the business context as well, I think is really important.
No, I've read that as well, replacing but with and suddenly the entire sort of emotional tenor of what you're saying changes. Mm-hmm. So, you might say to someone, even on your team, well, I like the argument you made here, but I think we should move it to a different page. Versus, I like the argument you made here, and I think we should move it somewhere else.
Yeah,
like,
it's a huge
totally
difference.
Simple thing, but it makes a huge difference.
It does make a huge difference. So, and think about for a client, how big of a difference that could sound. I think it's a very, very big deal. So starting to learn a little bit about how your language can even influence folks is really important. So plenty of books you can read. You can definitely look into classes, either at the business school, if you're in law school. Some undergraduate classes in psychology could really be interesting if you weren't a psychology major. I was a psychology major in law school, in undergrad, so I took a lot of psychology classes. One that I think a lot of people ignore that I think has a lot of value if you plan on managing people or working in an organization is organizational psychology, where it teaches you a lot about how people work together in teams, how to lead people, just what organizational structures, how they have the power to really shape how people feel and act in their jobs. It's pretty fascinating stuff. So if you find it fascinating, like I do, I would recommend checking out some stuff on organizational psychology and leadership.
No, and I think that's extremely valuable skill set to have as an attorney, and something that most attorneys are not that interested in. So if you are someone who's interested, you could end up being, a leader in whatever organization you're in, just because you actually do know how to manage people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is really worthwhile. And again, looking for opportunities to gain these skills. Maybe it's going to a leadership conference, or maybe there's some seminars on leadership or managing people available either through your bar association or through, business schools or whatever they might be. It could really change your career path if you're able to gain some of these skills, because you're just going to function better in the law firm marketplace.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think even simple stuff like listening, lawyers think that they're great listeners, but most of them really aren't.
Yeah, this one is a big one. I really, really think listening is such an underrated skill. And anytime I have been in a class or at a talk and they do a listening exercise, I'm always reminded at times how poor of a listener I can be. I know I hate to say it. I try and be a really good listener, but we all have our moments. And that doesn't just mean like looking at your phone while somebody's talking to you, which is a horrible thing to do while trying to listen to someone. But there's an interesting article that we'll link to in the show notes about this. But, we're often trying to think ahead of what we're going to say when somebody's talking to us. And that means we're not listening.
Right.
So there are exercises you can do to become a better listener. And if you can think about anyone that who's an amazing listener. So I have a friend who works as a chaplain, and they are highly trained listeners. I mean, they listen to people, talk to them about some of the most daunting stuff like death in life. And she is an incredible listener. I can talk to her about anything, and I feel so heard. It's amazing. It really is.
And that's a really valuable thing to make somebody experience. Everybody wants to feel like they're being heard. And if they go and see their lawyer and they feel like their lawyer hasn't listened to them, they're not going to like you very much.
Mm-hmm. And it can be tough because lawyers like to take notes. Lawyers like to do other things while talking to someone, but you have to find that personal balance of what will feel authentic to you, but being a very good listener and really making someone feel heard and making your client feel that you are valuing the time they're spending with you is going to go a long way to building trust and probably just having a better client relationship going forward.
Right. Sometimes I think lawyers think, oh, well, if I really listen to them, then I have to agree with what they're saying. And that's not the case. Mm-hmm. Your client might be telling you like what a great case they have. And you're like, well, actually, you don't really. But you have to explain that in a way that makes it clear that you really did listen and you heard them. Right. And you're the one whose job it is to tell them actually why they're unlikely to succeed.
Right. And
based on your legal knowledge.
And learning how to use different techniques to really engage someone in that conversation. So if you are listening intently to a client, using the techniques sometimes of repeating back to them what they have said, so you are sure you understand what they were saying and they feel that they have been heard. Then if you disagree with them, there's no like, no, you didn't hear me. It's like, no, right. I heard you.
Right. It's like, so, as I heard you say, this is your understanding of what happened. Okay. Well, based on that, there are 4 things we have to show for you to succeed in this case. And it doesn't sound to me like you're going to be able to show point number 3. Let me explain it to you.
Yeah, that's going to make a client feel very heard and that your advice is very thoughtful.
Versus just like, you don't have a case, sorry.
Right. Yeah. Or just being dismissive. And I think lawyers, because we have very busy brains, can oftentimes come off as very dismissive when we don't intend to.
For sure.
Yeah. So interesting work is being done in the mindfulness for lawyers space that I think really helps with not only emotional intelligence, but just how we deal with the conflict as lawyers. And one of our friends and a mentor of mine who's been doing this work for quite a while is named Judy Cohen. She offers mindfulness training for lawyers and law students, and her company is called Warrior One Lawyers. I think it's warrior1.com. We will link to it in the podcast notes.
You took a class with her, right?
I did. I actually took one of her mindfulness for lawyers classes, and it was really interesting. It was a series of classes. You got CLE credit for it, which was great. But I know exactly. We were just talking about CLE the other day. But we did these weekly classes, and each one had a different theme around mindfulness. But what I found the most fascinating, because a lot of the themes were things that I had already been introduced to, was just listening to the practicing lawyers in the room, because most people in the room were practicing lawyers, talking about how mindfulness and implementing mindfulness practices into their daily lives was really changing how they worked. So there were criminal lawyers in that room who talked about how meditating every day really allowed them to help control stress and focus better. So they would start their day with a daily meditation. Family law lawyers were in the room. Some of them talked about doing mindfulness practices before picking up the phone, especially with caller ID, when they would see a high conflict opposing counsel to be on the phone, but to do a mindfulness exercise to try and make sure that they didn't pick up the phone angry. Because we all know that feeling, right? You see the phone and then oh, yeah, your blood pressure surges.
I can't believe I have to talk to this person. And you're like, hello.
Yeah. And if you pick up the phone all amped up, I mean, I don't know why it's surprising to anyone that phone call isn't awful and it's going to feel awful. Other things that are often discussed in the mindfulness community is, love and kindness meditation, sending kindness out into the world, doing gratitude meditations. And that has been shown to make us happier people. It turns out that science actually backs it up. We're going to link to an article in the show notes that talks about this, that just doing gratitude every day literally changes the chemicals in your brain in the same way that antidepressants do.
Yeah, I found that fascinating. Like serotonin and dopamine, the exact channels, the things like Prozac are hitting. Mm-hmm. You can basically make those more favorable yourself just by doing certain gratitude type of meditations.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yep. And there is that moment, if you've ever done any sort of gratitude work, or you and I have both practiced yoga. One of my favorite yoga teachers always ends class with kind of a moment of gratitude. And every time you do it, even though I do it all, with most of my yoga practices on a consistent basis, I do have that moment where I'm like, yeah, I do lead a truly blessed life. Let me think for a minute about what is blessed in my life. And even if I've had a rotten day, or I've just come from a tough meeting, or whatever might have happened, you do kind of have that moment you're like, yeah, you're right. I do.
Actually, I am kind of one of the luckiest people to ever walk the earth.
Yeah. I'm glad. I know. So it's just a good reminder.
Really won the lottery of birth there.
Mm-hmm. And some folks even, I think there are apps that do this too, but put reminders on their phones to do a gratitude exercise periodically throughout the day, or to send love and kindness to people who are walking down the street. Or what's even harder is to send love and kindness to the people on the phone who are driving you crazy when you have to have that dialogue to them. It is really fascinating. Go ahead.
Yeah, and some of it can also be sort of reframing. So rather than, oh my God, this person is such a pain every time I talk to them, you start thinking, well, they're probably suffering something in their life, and that's why they're behaving this way.
Yep. I think that's really true.
It's a simple shift. You don't know which one's more accurate. Maybe they are just a jerk. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But maybe there's something going on, and that's why they're behaving like a jerk all the time.
Yeah. Regardless, I think the mindfulness space is doing some really interesting work with the legal profession. And if your school is not having a dialogue around mindfulness, there are plenty of people in the greater community that are. Another person that you can check out is Gina Cho, who we also know. She has a new book out called The Anxious Lawyer, which talks about setting up a mindfulness practice, and something like that can walk you through the process. There are a lot of opportunities to learn these skills, but even if you're not necessarily going to sit on a meditation cushion and meditate every day, I think that these lessons that come out of mindfulness can be brought through your daily life and create some more positive outcomes for you, both in your personal space and in your professional space.
Right, because I think the reality is people might be resistant to sort of this, hippie stuff, whatever. Like, I don't want to think about my feelings. But the reality is, if you don't have the skills to manage the stress and pressure of the legal profession, which you're almost certainly going to experience, it's going to end up coming out in different ways, whether it's burnout, whether it's substance abuse problems, which are rampant in the legal profession, or just a general unhappiness and, a desire to I just have to get out of the law. You don't have to reach that point. There are ways that you can set those kind of break points before you reach the point of being burned out, drinking too much, doing who knows what. People act out in a lot of different ways if they are not managing their feelings in different ways. So I think, you can almost look at this as brain exercise, just like you would exercise your body. If you sit around and eat crappy food and work 14 hours a day and never exercise, you're going to see physical results of that pretty quickly. And you might not see the results on a mental or emotional level as quickly, but you're seeing the same kind of thing unless you're kind of exercising these, skills.
I think that's really true. I also think one other space that you don't necessarily have to go out and get a therapist just so you can gain emotional intelligence. But I think the process, if you are in a place that you are looking for guidance, of working with a therapist, somebody who is actually trained in helping you cope with, something that's going on in your life, you can learn valuable lessons there too that make you have a higher emotional intelligence for dealing with other folks when they are suffering. So I think the interesting thing about emotional intelligence is you can continue to work on it throughout your life, but to start your professional life, I think you can do a few things in the next year or two to really give yourself a better, let's say, toolbox of skills to pull from when needed.
Yeah, and speaking of therapists, there are actually lots of lawyer-turned therapists out there. One who comes to mind is Will Meyerhofer, who writes a column for Above the Law. But, there are people who've been through what you've gone through and come out the other side and are there to help you. Yep. So if you are struggling, there definitely are ways that you can manage this struggle and figure out something that, makes you happier.
Yep, agreed. Well, with that, I think we're out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.